Deshaun Watson would miss more time next year. Browns owner Jimmy Haslam had shared his thoughts on their decision to trade for Deshaun Watson, saying took a big swing and miss with Deshaun.
Well, Laura, it's what a lot of people are thinking, but it's another thing for the owner of the Cleveland Browns to come out and say it.
In the offseason of 2020, the Cleveland Browns had to undergo one of their biggest transitions to date, and it wasn't one that they were necessarily very optimistic of. Following their huge swing and miss in the 2019 offseason in hiring Freddie Kitchens, trading for Odell Beckham Jr. and Olivier Vernon, the Cleveland Browns were frustrated by the fact that they only went 6-10 in the regular season. So they decided to hire Kevin Stefanski in hopes that he could fix their biggest issue, which is taking a very talented offense on paper and trying to make sure that they lived up to their potential. And ultimately, it worked. The 2020 Cleveland Browns had one of their best seasons in over a decade, finishing 11-5, defeating the Pittsburgh Steelers in the wild card round and coming very close to defeating the Kansas City Chiefs in the divisional round. They were able to achieve this in Baker Mayfield's most successful season with the Cleveland Browns to date, in a season where he threw for over 3,500 passing yards, 26 touchdowns, and 8 interceptions. So going into the 2021 season, Cleveland Browns fans were very optimistic. But unfortunately, the worst case scenario would occur. Baker Mayfield would sustain a shoulder injury and would try his absolute best to play on this shoulder injury. The result was an absolute disaster. Baker Mayfield would go 6-8 in the games played. He had his second worst completion percentage as a Cleveland Brown, would throw 17 touchdowns to 13 interceptions, and even Odell Beckham Jr.'s father claimed that Baker Mayfield was sabotaging his son, reposting a famous video onto Instagram that eventually led to OBJ's release. It didn't really help out Baker Mayfield's case when Odell Beckham Jr. went to the LA Rams and played a role in them winning a Super Bowl that year. So in the offseason, the Cleveland Browns had a huge decision to make. Do they sign Baker Mayfield to a long-term contract, or do they decide that Baker Mayfield just isn't talented enough to lead this team to a Super Bowl? Ultimately, they decided that there was a much better quarterback option available to them. Deshaun Watson, who was 1 year removed from playing football and had a huge series of allegations brought forth against him, was available for trade, and he was literally doing a tour of potential teams he wanted to sign with. He visited with the Carolina Panthers, the Atlanta Falcons, and the Cleveland Browns. Even before that, the Miami Dolphins were rumored in being interested in trading for Deshaun Watson. So the Cleveland Browns initially offered Deshaun Watson a contract, but he said that he just simply didn't want to play for Cleveland. So Cleveland felt like they needed to go all out to win the bidding war on Deshaun Watson, and eventually they made him an offer that he simply couldn't refuse. And they also made the Houston Texans an offer that they simply couldn't refuse. The Cleveland Browns would essentially gift the Houston Texans an instant rebuild, trading their 2022 first and fourth round pick, a 2023 first and third round pick, and a 2024 first and fourth round pick for Deshaun Watson, but it didn't stop there. The Cleveland Browns then offered Deshaun Watson the contract of a lifetime, a contract that would never get replicated ever again, a 5-year, $230 million contract, fully guaranteed. Quarterbacks have since tried and failed to get the same exact contract because it was so bizarre. And this trade, without a doubt, robbed the Cleveland Browns of any opportunity of potentially competing for a Super Bowl. Deshaun Watson was suspended for the first 11 games of the 2022 regular season, and in the games that he did play with the Cleveland Browns, he didn't really look like himself. His completion percentage dipped from a 70.2% in his final season with the Houston Texans to a 58.2% with the Cleveland Browns. He threw 7 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, and over 1,100 passing yards, but fans were suggesting that maybe he was just rusty. In his second season with the Cleveland Browns, he had significantly more team success, but it was more of the same. The games weren't necessarily won because of Deshaun Watson himself. He would complete 61% of his passes, throw 7 touchdowns to 4 interceptions, but would lead the Cleveland Browns to a 5-1 record in the 6 games played before he would fracture his throwing shoulder in the first half versus the Baltimore Ravens. He would undergo season-ending surgery to repair his broken bone in his throwing shoulder, and that would be the end of the 2023 season. So in 2024, Cleveland Browns fans were really hoping that Deshaun Watson could return to 50% of the player that he was when he was with the Houston Texans. Meanwhile, the Houston Texans instantly rebuilt their team, using the picks to draft CJ Stroud, trade up for Will Anderson Jr., and practically hitting on all of their draft picks. But this season with the Cleveland Browns would be Deshaun Watson's worst season to date. Statistically speaking, Deshaun Watson is without a doubt the worst quarterback in Cleveland Browns history, which is crazy when you consider how terrible Cleveland Browns quarterbacks have been. But to give you an idea, in October, Deshaun Watson had a streak of failing to convert on 26 straight third downs. Fans were clamoring for Joe Flacco, the quarterback that replaced Deshaun Watson towards the end of the previous season, because in the start of this year's regular season, Joe Flacco was outperforming Deshaun Watson. And sure, Flacco had a horrible send-off with the Cleveland Browns in his final game with the Cleveland Browns. And yeah, it looked even worse that the Browns opted not to re-sign Flacco because Deshaun Watson considered him to be a threat. But the statistics would get even worse. Bill Barnwell would mention how 566 quarterbacks have thrown at least 100 passes in the first 6 games of their team's respective seasons. By first downs per attempt, Deshaun Watson and Bo Nix were tied at about 22%, and Deshaun Watson was in last place out of those 566 quarterbacks since 2007. Now, Bo Nix gets a pass because he's a rookie QB on a team that didn't really have that many weapons offensively, and eventually he would turn it around, which was even more impressive. But Deshaun Watson would just keep getting worse and worse. In weeks 1 to 3, the Browns' offensive success rate was the lowest it has ever been in any season, meaning that Deshaun Watson was leading an all-time bad offense for the Cleveland Browns. He would finish with a QBR of 23.4, which is just slightly better than Blaine Gabbert's 22.2 in 2011 and Jimmy Clausen's 13.8 in 2010. And probably the worst part of all is, according to this article by Austin Gale, Deshaun Watson is statistically worse than Jamarcus Russell. Through weeks 1 through 6 this season, Watson had generated a minus 66.2 EPA on dropbacks, which beat Russell's minus 62.8 EPA on dropbacks in weeks 1 through 6 in 2009 for a record low this millennium. Now, fans were hoping that Deshaun Watson would be able to somehow, some way turn this around, but the way he was handling this situation didn't make things any better. For instance, instead of holding himself accountable for things like this, he would opt to throw his head coach under the bus.
Sean, if Dorsey brought all this new stuff in, should he be the one calling the plays?
That's a Kevin question.
And wouldn't even acknowledge how terrible he was playing.
Not on Twitter. I'm not on any social media or things like that. So anytime that stuff comes up, the only time I first hear it is either you guys are bringing it up or, somebody else outside, and I just don't know who it's coming from. So
fans were angry at the fact that the Cleveland Browns wouldn't just switch over to Jameis Winston, but the Cleveland Browns couldn't, because he was set to make $45 million this year, $45 million fully guaranteed next year, and another $45 million fully guaranteed the year after that, with cap hits of $72.9 million in both years. It was a true disaster, and the Cleveland Browns were stuck. The worst part of all was the Cleveland Browns defense was carrying them to victories, meaning if they just stuck with Baker Mayfield and kept their draft picks and used that draft capital to make an already strong defense even stronger, there's no question that they could have been the most dominant team in their division, which is saying something when you share a division with the Pittsburgh Steelers and Baltimore Ravens. But on October 20th versus the Cincinnati Bengals, all of this would come to an end. Deshaun Watson would get carted off of the field after tearing his Achilles tendon. And the craziest part of this was fans were cheering about it, which led to this now famous Jameis Winston interview.
And I do not want the treatment that Deshaun Watson has received from these passionate fans. I know you love this game. So when I first got here, I knew these were some amazing fans, but Deshaun was treated badly. And now he has to overcome another obstacle. So I'm gonna support him, I'm gonna lift him up, and I'm gonna be there for him, because I see the way he fights. I see the way that he works, and I know who he is as a person and as an NFL quarterback. And that's all I have to say.
Now, as you could tell from what I've told you in this video so far, the Cleveland Browns' plan A was to just ride it out with Deshaun Watson, and hopefully he'll magically regain form eventually. But obviously, following the torn Achilles, the Browns really didn't have much of a choice but to consider moving on from him, especially because during the offseason, it was reported that Deshaun Watson re-tore his Achilles tendon. This came to us from Adam Schefter on January 10th, saying that Deshaun Watson underwent surgery that Thursday after tearing his Achilles again, and now his status for the 2025 season is in jeopardy. And the worst part of all is the Cleveland Browns have to pay Deshaun Watson fully guaranteed money, even though he has to sit out the 2025 season. But the thing is, even if Deshaun Watson was to play during the 2025 season, I'm not really confident in his ability to return to form in 2025 if he was already so terrible the year prior before tearing his Achilles. You saw what a torn Achilles tendon did to Kirk Cousins, you saw what it did to Aaron Rodgers. It's very difficult to come back from that injury, especially if it's your back foot, which you depend on for planting your leg and driving the football. Deshaun Watson's right shoulder was already injured, and it was clearly affecting his ability to throw the football. Now imagine him with a torn right Achilles tendon and playing on a repaired shoulder. It just doesn't seem like he's ever going to return to form. Even furthermore, why would he be motivated to return to form? He's getting paid fully guaranteed money anyway, and there's zero chance that another team would want to sign him after his tenure with the Browns. The Cleveland Browns were trying to do everything they could to try to potentially get out of his contract, but it really doesn't look like they will be able to. And the entire Deshaun Watson experience has just been terrible. He's only played 19 games for the Cleveland Browns during this contract, and the Browns' decisions throughout this era just doesn't seem to make much sense. For instance, Myles Garrett demanded a trade in the beginning of the offseason, primarily because he knew there was no way he could compete for a Super Bowl with the Cleveland Browns, but the Cleveland Browns made him an offer that he simply couldn't refuse, offering him a contract that pays him an average of $40 million a year, completely resetting the edge rusher market once again. And here's where it gets really interesting. The Browns opted to restructure Deshaun Watson's contract in order to pay Myles Garrett this amount, but Deshaun Watson's career could very well be over, at least according to Dr. Jesse Morse.
This will put him out the entire 2025 season. And in my opinion, this is probably going to be career ending.
So we didn't really know what the Cleveland Browns plans were up until this point, until on Monday when Browns owners Jimmy and Dee Haslam acknowledged that they made a horrific mistake, saying that the Browns are still recovering from a big swing and a miss on Deshaun Watson, having paid him $230 million fully guaranteed and traded 3 first-round picks and more. Hold me and Dee accountable. There's no bigger indication that a team is planning on moving on from a player than when they admit that trading for that player was a horrific mistake when that player is still technically under contract. Even if they were to move on from Deshaun Watson, it is going to be a huge mess. I mean, Watson is set to earn $46 million this year and next year, and has an $81 million cap hit in 2026, and over $55 million in dead money once he's gone. Yeah, this is the clearest sign that his time as the Browns starting QB is likely over despite those numbers. And if so, he will have started just 19 total games. We've seen teams take on dead cap hits before for the sake of moving on from a player that they just simply didn't want to be associated with anymore. The most recent example was Russell Wilson when the Denver Broncos released him even before his brand new contract extension was set to kick in. Russell Wilson had an $85 million cap hit, and the Broncos opted to spread out that cap hit over 2 years, $53 million in 2024 and $32 million in 2025. I personally speculated that the Broncos were going to be terrible as a result of it, but it turns out it was a good move for them. They were able to make the playoffs under first-year QB Bo Nix, and Denver Broncos fans have the most hope that they've ever had. But the thing is, Russell Wilson's contract was never restructured. They just bit the bullet head on before the contract extension even kicked in. In the case of the Cleveland Browns, they just consistently kicked the can further down the road each and every year. So if they were to move on from him right now, his dead cap hit would be $172 million. So moving on from Deshaun Watson in of itself is very complicated because his contract is fully guaranteed. And the Browns are in a very unique situation. They currently hold the number 2 pick in the NFL draft. The Tennessee Titans have the number 1 overall pick. Many people are speculating that they select Cam Ward with that top pick. And then the Cleveland Browns get number 2, and they have an option to either take Abdul Carter, an edge rusher that is being compared to Micah Parsons, or Shedeur Sanders. And so far, they've said great things about both. Kevin Stefanski said that Shedeur Sanders is a very talented young man, but off the field, that is where I'm probably most impressed, which is very interesting because Shedeur Sanders has gone viral for some of the stuff he's done off the field, whether it's flexing his watch in front of players or driving lavish cars. But for the most part, scouts love Shedeur Sanders for his completion percentage behind one of the worst offensive lines in all of college football. So that's one direction the Browns can go in. They could select their quarterback of the future with the number 2 overall pick, or they could select Abdul Abdul Carter, a player that has been compared to Micah Parsons, not just because he played for Penn State and is wearing the number 11, but because of his versatility. So if the Cleveland Browns want to consistently double down on the strongest part of their team, which is obviously their defense, they could select Abdul Carter and put him on the opposing edge from Myles Garrett. And they can move forward with Kenny Pickett, which I honestly don't think is a bad idea. Do I think Kenny Pickett is a Super Bowl winning QB? Not really, but Kevin Stefanski says that Kenny Pickett's a guy I believe in and we believe in. Pickett isn't going to be asked to play hero ball, rather he'd be asked to depend on the Cleveland Browns rushing attack and just manage games. In my personal opinion, the dream scenario for the Cleveland Browns would be to trade back from the number 2 overall pick. Not because Abdul Carter isn't good enough, but because this is a loaded draft at the edge rusher position. And the Cleveland Browns also have other needs aside from the edge. And they really can't go wrong with any of these needs. Their biggest position of need is obviously quarterback, but would it be worth drafting a quarterback and putting him in the situation that the Browns are currently in? The Cleveland Browns also have needs at the running back position, the tight end position, and they could use some additional depth at safety. Obviously, the biggest position of need would be QB in this point, but if they wanted to trade back, add additional draft capital, and then address those needs, I think that would be a dream scenario for the Browns. Either way, one thing seems to be certain, and that's that the Cleveland Browns are going to release Deshaun Watson, probably as a post-June 1st designation so they could spread out his cap hit. And if they do, this would without a doubt be one of the worst trades in NFL history. If you're a Cleveland Browns fan, let me know in the comment section down below, what do you think about all this? Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.